know, when I started this video, I was like, you know what, I'm gonna do top 10, maybe top 15, but then I asked for some advice, and guess how many? 40 beginner mistakes we're gonna help you avoid this video. A big thanks as always to our sponsor, Coral Vault. Why am I pointing at this? Well, he used to be called Tyler's Tanks, and a lot of you probably know him as Tyler's Tank, but now he's Coral Vault, so I got one of his last awesome t-shirts. I just got a Coral Vault shipment in, so here, let me show you. I texted Tyler, the owner, the other day, and I was like, I need some beautiful anemones. And so he came through with 3 gorgeous rose bubble tip, rainbow, tricolor, whatever you're gonna call them. Fantastic, good size, good product, packed really well, always arrive on time. If you haven't checked them out yet, coral-vault.com. Fantastic company, amazing customer service. I just can't say enough positives about them. Check them out, www.coral-vault.com. Hey everybody, Matthew here from My First Fish Tank in collaboration with Marine Depot, coming at you with week 11 in the beginner how-to guide for saltwater aquariums and reef tanks. 40 beginner mistakes. Yes, you heard me right. 40 beginner mistakes we're gonna help you avoid. By the way, I need to thank several people for making this video even happen. Well over half of these didn't come from me. I asked my friends, Metrocat, Hillary from Waterlogged, my blogger Max, and I asked the Instagram community, so thanks to all of you who contributed. If you missed any of the weeks in the series 1 through 10, we will put a link up here and in the description below. Please consider subscribing to My First Fish Tank and to Marine Depot. And if you have a friend or a family member who you think would be a perfect match for starting a saltwater aquarium, if you could be so kind and share this series with them. And of course, my blogger Max has been busy working, and he finished the blog for this one as well. So go to myfirstfishtank.com and click on start here, or just click blog down below. Let's get going. We got 40 beginner mistakes to talk about. Our first category is research. So number 1 is don't believe every Tom, Dick, and Harry. I mean, if there are people on the internet who think the world is flat, then there are people on the internet and hobbyists who are just plain wrong. So you need to do so much research in this hobby, and don't even believe the things I say. But one surefire clue to know that you shouldn't trust a person, if they say they are 100% right and everybody else is an idiot. So do your research, go to reputable sources, and make decisions for yourself. Category number 2 is patience, and tip number 2 is be proactive, not reactive. How does that saying go? An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It is especially true in this hobby. If you do your planning and you take steps to have long-term success, you're gonna be so much better off than just reacting to problems you see. The third beginner mistake is rushing. Don't rush in this hobby. When we're talking about good things taking time, we're not talking about a few hours or a few days. We're talking about several months. No joke. Things can take several months to settle in. Any one of my tanks here takes 6 months probably to really settle in, where I can start doing water testing and find stability. So don't rush yourself in this hobby. Know that good things take time, and be patient. Number 4 beginner mistake is tinkering too much. I still do this. I still tinker too much because you know what? Things are going well. Everything looks good in my tank. Something must be going wrong. Maybe I'll just tweak this little thing, or maybe I'll turn the flow up here, or maybe I'll start dosing this. Don't tinker. Don't tinker. If your tank looks good and things are going well, just let it be. And the 5th beginner mistake is solving problems that don't exist. I know this sounds ridiculous. I do this all the time. I am constantly solving problems that don't exist. Let me give you one example, okay, right over here. I just did this. The problem was high nitrates, 25-ish, right? Everything in the tank is healthy and happy. Every fish is good, every coral is good. But I'm like, oh my gosh, I had this preconceived idea that my nitrates have to be somewhere around 3 to 5. What did I do? I went out and I started a biopellet reactor. Why in the world would I start a biopellet reactor when the tank is healthy and looks good? So don't solve problems that don't exist. Category number 3 is money, and we're up to beginner mistake number 6, underestimating the cost. There are plenty of videos. I have even made these videos about budget builds. There's a section on my website, budget builds. Marine Depot has budget build videos, and they have them like, wow, build a saltwater aquarium for under $150. Wow, build a saltwater aquarium for less than $100. I'm not saying these are wrong, but that might just be for the equipment. That does not include electricity costs. That does not include salt water, water changes, RODI, evaporation. That doesn't include your fish food, your livestock. Can you do things cheaper? Absolutely, you can do things cheaper. But don't underestimate the cost. And if somebody tries to sell you a tank and says you can do this for really, really cheap, be suspicious and double and triple their estimate, and that's probably a bit more accurate. Beginner mistake number 7, buying the most expensive gear out there because you just think it's going to be better. For some things, this is going to be true. You're going to have to pay for quality, right? But if you have a $1,000 light versus a $300 light, is it going to be worth the extra $700? Probably not. What's really important here is to read your reviews and don't just assume that more expensive equals better. But on the other hand, don't go budget shopping. Don't go to random websites and buy the absolute cheapest thing out there, because I will tell you, the cheapest options out there will usually break and not hold up over time. The 8th beginner mistake comes from Harkins Aquatics, our friend in Las Vegas, buying a smaller tank just because it's cheaper. Smaller tanks are notoriously more difficult for stability, and we're talking anything really under 20 gallons. If you just wait a little bit longer and save up a little bit more money, you can go with a 40 gallon, a 75 gallon, something larger that's gonna have greater upfront costs, but gonna grant you more stability in the short term and in the long run. We're up to category number 4, livestock. And beginner mistake number 9 comes from our friend Cole Woods on Instagram. And the mistake is impulse fish buying. The last time I did it, I went to my local fish store and I saw a triggerfish, and in my mind I was thinking pufferfish, and I bought the triggerfish, I brought it home, I put it in this tank right here, and it immediately attacked and ate another fish. Never buy a fish without doing your research. There are just so many problems with impulsively buying a fish. You don't know if they're right for your tank, you don't know how healthy they are, you don't know what to look for. So wait, do some research, and buy the fish that you know and that you've researched and that belong in your tank. Beginner mistake number 10 is adding the wrong cleanup crew, adding a cleanup crew too early, and adding too many members of a cleanup crew. Cleanup crews are tricky because different members of a cleanup crew do vastly different things. There are snails, there are crabs, there are urchins, there are sea stars, there are sand sifters, there are small ones that get into cracks, there are there's so many different things. And the mistake is to just buy a whole bunch of different things and put them in your tank because they're probably gonna starve to death and die. You only need to start adding a cleanup crew when there's an issue in your tank. So wait until you see a little bit of algae growth, and then it's probably time to buy some algae-eating snails. Your trochus snails, your margarita snails, your turbo snails. If you start seeing algae, it's probably also a good time to add hermit crabs. If you have a deep sand bed and you notice a lot of detritus building up, then consider a sand-sifting goby or a sand-sifting starfish if you have a really, really big system. I'm not trying to recommend what cleanup crew it is, but go slowly with your cleanup crew and only add things as it's needed. You can always add more as time goes on. Beginner mistake number 11 is overfeeding your fish and an over-reliance on pellets. I honestly used solely pellet food for probably 5 years in my career in this hobby, and mainly because it was super easy. I didn't like the extra step of having to thaw frozen food. But the problem with over-relying on pellets is they are so more nutrient rich and oftentimes will raise the phosphate levels in your tank drastically with just a little bit of overfeeding, which leads to nuisance algae growth. Don't over-rely on pellet foods. I would recommend using frozen foods almost all of the time and just supplementing with pellet foods for when you're on vacation or you need someone else to come over and feed your tank. Beginner mistake number 12 comes from our Instagram follower Mech Moho, and it is buying a finicky fish and not doing your research. There are just some fish in this hobby, and if you go to somewhere like Live Aquaria, it will tell you if it's intermediate fish, beginner fish, or an expert only fish. But there are so many fish that are so beautiful that we just shouldn't have. A perfect example is a copper band butterfly fish. Everybody wants a copper band. I've had a copper band butterfly fish. But unless you have a tank that is incredibly well established with a huge amount of microfauna and copepods, an amazing amount of biological diversity, and a ton of feeding, it's probably gonna starve and die. So do your research, and if you're a beginner, please, please, please don't buy fish that are finicky eaters. Save that for down the road after you've established yourself in the hobby. Mistake number 13 is putting fish together that don't belong together. Now, how do you know this? Well, one, you can ask your local fish store, or two, you can go to somewhere like Live Aquaria. They have whole charts about which fish can live well together. Some fish are community fish. Some fish live good with one member of their own species, but not two. Some fish are aggressive and will eat other fish. Some fish like the sandbed and some fish like to swim out in the open. It's really important to do your research to know which fish can live well together before adding them to your tank. Beginner mistake number 14 is adding too much too soon. This goes with any kind of livestock. Adding a cleanup crew too much too soon, adding fish too much too soon, adding corals too much too soon. Even though your tank is likely cycled by the time you're adding all of this, especially at the beginning, every time you add some new type of livestock, it's going to cause your nutrients to spike and may kick off another mini cycle, which could raise the ammonia level and lead to stress and lead to die-off. So be smart and add things slowly. Let the tank settle in before you add more. Beginner mistake number 15 is not having an ultimate goal in mind. Just buying a tank and throwing stuff in there. It's going to lead to a huge headache. I always recommend this to beginners. Always, always, always. Have a vision of what you want. Now, this doesn't mean you have to know exactly what kind of tank you want, but if you know there's one piece of livestock, a fish, a shark, a coral, something you can't live without, well, that one piece of livestock may have very specific requirements that require you to build the entire tank around it. So don't make the mistake that a lot of beginners make and just buying whatever they see and putting stuff in a tank. Know your goal, know where you want to be in a year, and then buy your gear and your livestock around that goal. Mistake number 16 is adding fish before the cycle is complete. Yes, I know that a lot of people do fish in cycling. They add the fish and they cycle the tank. I never recommend that. I don't think it's very nice on the fish. So be sure to wait until your cycle is complete, and at a bare minimum, wait until your ammonia level spikes and then goes all the way down. Now, there are some exceptions to this. I know of some products like a Fritz Turbo Start that if you use this correctly in conjunction with adding a couple hardy fish, then you might not need to do this. But as a general rule, most beginners rush and add fish too early. Wait till the cycle is done before adding your fish. And beginner mistake number 17, the final mistake in the livestock category, is overfeeding your corals. Here's the reality. Unless you have a non-photosynthetic coral, your coral will likely gain 85%, maybe 90% of all of its food and nutritional needs from the photosynthetic zooxanthellae that live in the polyps. You won't need to feed it at all. Can you feed your coral? Yes. And do I recommend in the long term feeding your coral? Absolutely. But when you're a beginner and you're learning the ropes, feeding your coral, one, beginners often feed way too much and way too often, and it might lead to problems, especially algae blooms or bacterial blooms in your tank. So as a beginner, just hold off for a little while on feeding your corals until the tank settles in, and then go very, very slowly, maybe start feeding once a week and feed a small amount. We're up to category number 5, filtration, and beginner mistake number 18, which is overusing chemical media. We used to think that your goal was to have 0 nitrates and 0 phosphates, right? And if you ran GFO to get rid of phosphates and it says run 2 tablespoons per 8 gallons, well, why not do 4? Why not do 6 if the goal is to have 0? But what we've realized in this hobby over time is that your tank needs phosphates and it needs nitrates in the water column in order for your corals and inverts to survive. So we no longer think the goal is to have 0. So I only recommend using chemical media if you have a need. For example, if your phosphates are super high, don't jump right in to using GFO. Try changing out your filter sock more. Try doing some larger water changes. Try adding some sort of macroalgae refugium. There are other things you can do that don't just destroy and suck out essential nutrients from your tank. Common beginner mistake number 19, I'm not the only one who actually recommended this one, is not buying an RODI filter. You don't need an RODI filter. I know that. You can buy distilled water. You can go to your local fish store and buy RODI water. But let me just tell you right now, if you buy an RODI filter as your first purchase, it will save you so much money in the long run and so much time. I mean, the amount of time it saves you in hassle alone will repay itself in 6 months. If you don't know what type of RODI filter to buy, we have several videos on that. You can call Marine Depot. They will go ahead and answer that for you. There's a few things to consider, and the learning curve on RODI filters can be steep as a beginner, but please listen to this one. It will save you so much hassle and so much time and so much energy and so much money to just buy an RODI filter up front. Common beginner error number 20, we're at the halfway point, is overcomplicating things. For example, there is so much filtration gear out there, but let's be honest, this tank right here, you know how much filtration it has? I know I've said this before, one single sponge. When on the other hand, you know this tank over here, it has a UV sterilizer, it has a GFO reactor, it has a biopellet reactor, it has a protein skimmer, it has a macroalgae refugium, right? You don't need this to have success, and a lot of beginners overcomplicate things. And when you overcomplicate things at the beginning, when a problem happens, you don't know how to diagnose it and to fix it. What do you really need for success at the beginning if you go slow? You need some sort of mechanical filtration. That's really it. So keep it simple at the beginning and only add things in as you need them. Common mistake number 20 comes from our follower Dash of Reef, and I totally forgot about this. Don't use tap water and a dechlorinator. If you're coming from a freshwater side, you're like, why can't I do that? Of course I can do that, because in the freshwater hobby, you just pour some tap water in, put some drops of dechlorinator, and you're good to go. You might be able to find success doing that in the short term if you're doing a fish-only system, but long term, especially with corals, don't do that. Do distilled water, or better yet, do RODI water only when making your salt water. And beginner mistake number 22 is going with a bare bottom tank. Let's see here, my anemone quarantine tank is bare bottom, but that's a quarantine tank. This quarantine tank is bare bottom. The harem tank has a sand bed, the reef tank has a sand bed, and then the new 14-gallon peninsula tank is also bare bottom. The issue with going with a bare bottom tank is you are losing a massive amount of surface area for beneficial bacteria to colonize. The biggest thing beginners struggle with in the hobby is stability, and we're talking water parameter stability. We're talking nitrogen cycle stability with your ammonia, with your nitrite, with your nitrate, with your phosphate. And if you remove that biological sand bed, all that you have left is your reef rock, and most human-made reef rock is just simply not nearly as porous as the reef rock that you're going to find in the ocean. So you may struggle with keeping stability. So as a beginner, do a sand bed. Even if it's a very shallow sand bed of an inch or less, it will help you with stability in the long run. And then in the future, if you want to go bare bottom, you'll have the experience you need to do that. Category number 6 is lighting, and common beginner mistake number 23 comes from our friend Blake Stewart 12 on Instagram. And this mistake is having way too much green and red in your spectrum, which is going to cause algae growth. This is kind of an advanced topic when we're talking about spectrum and intensity, but we have learned, and if you look at grow lights online, greens and reds and white to some extent especially, algae loves these spectrums and will thrive in that system. You can really run a tank lighting fixture without any reds and any greens. I will say that in all my AI primes, I use a very small portion. Where I may use 100% of the blues, I might do 10% or less of the greens and of the reds. You don't need them in your tank, and if you use too much of them, you may cause unwanted algae growth. Number 24 is not knowing the PAR levels in your tank and running too much PAR. Especially if you're buying a light that there isn't a lot of reviews on, you really have no idea what that PAR is, and you may just turn them up all the way, and then all of a sudden your corals start dying and there's just algae growing everywhere. Well, you may have too much PAR. It could be other things, but you may have way too much PAR. Something really important for long-term success is knowing the PAR levels all over your tank and setting your lights accordingly. It is 100% worth it to either borrow a PAR meter from a local hobbyist or to rent one online and to measure the PAR all over your tank to get your lights in just right, because then you won't have to touch the lights from there on out. Not knowing your PAR or having too much PAR in your tank is a common beginner mistake and can lead to coral death and a lot of unwanted algae growth. Common beginner mistake number 25 comes from our Instagram follower Horn Donald, and it is having too long of a photo period. Now, if you think about it, most corals grow somewhere near the equator, right? And equator has roughly 12 hours of sunlight each day, but it doesn't have 12 hours of a strong photo period. That includes all the sunrise hours and all the sunset hours, and oftentimes in these island communities, there are large mountains, so there's a shadow over the reef. So really, when we're talking about having a photo period, you want to have your lights at full intensity somewhere around 7 to 8 hours a day. Then you can do a ramp up and a ramp down, which will help keep your tank looking beautiful in the morning and in the evening, but will also not put too much light for too long into your tank. Category number 7, quarantine. It only has one common beginner mistake, And this was the most common beginner mistake we saw. So we're on beginner mistake number 26, and this comes from pretty much everybody I previously mentioned, as well as Maleshka14 and Big Manny Rosales on Instagram, not setting up a quarantine tank. Now, I'm going to say this over and over again, and I didn't set up a quarantine tank as a beginner, and I regretted it. I have a friend in the UK who just set up his first tank, and it was going really, really, really well, and then he bought a fish, he introduced it to the tank, and it had an ick outbreak and killed almost every single fish. Guess what he's doing now? He's setting up a quarantine tank. Setting up a quarantine tank isn't a huge investment. It can be done simply, and it can be set up, and it can be broken down. We're gonna go way more detail into quarantine tanks later, but don't make this extremely common beginner mistake and think that you're going to get away with it. Set up a quarantine tank. I promise you, you won't regret it. Category number 8 is maintenance, and common beginner error number 27 is over vacuuming your sand bed. I'll admit, I have done this one for years. We just think, oh, it looks ugly, there's algae on it, there's detritus in there, I need to vacuum it up. No, what you really need to do is lightly vacuum your sand bed and then purchase additional cleanup crew members, whether that's snails or sand sifters, to help aerate and clean that sand bed. When you constantly disturb your sand bed, you're constantly destroying and disrupting the biological filtration and biological diversity in that sand bed. Do it only occasionally and just a little bit at a time. The 28th most common beginner mistake is skipping water changes. Now, for all of us, the biggest hassle every single week is having to do a water change. And yes, there are stories out there of people who haven't done water changes in a year. They're called ultra low maintenance systems. And for a seasoned intermediate or pro in this hobby, they know what to do and they can get away with it because they are adding other dosing in, trace elements, major minor elements. If you're a beginner, don't skip your water changes. I do water changes every week. I do water changes on all these tanks, and I probably go through about 60 gallons of new salt water every single week. It is going to help keep your tank stable. It is going to help remove bad things, and it is going to help add back in good things like your major minor and your trace elements. So don't skip your water changes. Do at least a 10% water change every single week. Beginner mistake number 29. I actually haven't made this mistake, which is kind of amazing. Refilling your tank with salt water and not RODI water. Now, many of you know this, if not all of you know this. When your tank evaporates water, it only evaporates fresh water. So over time, if you didn't refill it with fresh water, your tank would get saltier and saltier. So just make sure that when you top off your tank every day, whether or not you're using a pitcher or you have an auto top off system, that you're only using distilled or RODI water and not salt water. Beginner mistake number 30. I've done this so many times and I still do it. The mistake is walking away during a water change. I have had at least 2 or 3 massive spills, and I mean having 10, 20 gallons of salt water all over my floor. Don't walk away during a water change. Don't think, oh, I'll remember that I'm using this gravel vac and I'm using it into a 5-gallon bucket. No, something will happen, something will come up, and you will forget it, and you'll come back, and your tank will be completely empty, and water will be all over your flow. And if for some reason you do walk away during a water change, be sure to at least set a timer so you don't forget. Number 31 is not properly washing your hands. It is by far best practice to never put your hands in your tank. By far, right? If you're gonna put your hands in your tank, put on these big, long, shoulder-length gloves. That's the best practice. Do many of us do that? No, absolutely not. Because if you put on gloves, you don't oftentimes have that tactile feel. So if you're placing corals, sometimes you can't reach in areas. So most of us will put our hands in the tank from time to time. Don't just wash with soap and then put your hands in your tank, because that soapy residue is not very good. Somebody on YouTube really suggested this washing technique, which I actually use now, which I think is fantastic. When you are going to wash your hands, take off your ring, take off your watch, put them in your pocket, rinse with hot water, then soap. Then grab vinegar, rub vinegar all over your arms, just common white vinegar, rinse it off. Do it one more time even. Wash with soap, rinse it off, use white vinegar, rub it, rinse it off. Your last rinse off after your white vinegar, just rinse it off really, really, really well. And that's probably the best practice that I've seen so far. If you know a better way of how to wash your hands before you put your hands in the tank, leave a comment below. That'd be really great. Beginner mistake number 32 is using cleaning products or aerosols near your tank. Don't do it. Don't use any aerosol product or any cleaning product. If you have to wipe down your tank with something, just use a wet rag. I don't recommend using Pledge, recommending using Endust or any other cleaning product anywhere near your tank, because you don't want that to get into your tank. So just do yourself a favor and use a wet rag. Category number 9 is water testing, and we're up to number 33, the 33rd beginner mistake that we don't want you to make is chasing pH. Oh my gosh, I did this so much. My first aquarium, the Red Sea Reefer 170, I had it in this basement apartment in Mercer Island, and we had 4 of us living in this tiny apartment in the winter, and our carbon dioxide levels were through the roof, and my pH was like 7.6, 7.7, and I tried everything to raise that pH, from kalkwater to protein skimming to running airline tubing outside, and it didn't work. And at the end of the day, why did I do it? There was no reason for it, because my corals were happy and my fish were happy. The reality is, if you live in a cold environment, your pH is probably going to be on the lower end, especially in the wintertime with all of the doors and windows closed. As long as your fish look good, as long as your corals look good, they're going to be fine. A much more important factor to consider is your alkalinity level, right? Just make sure your alkalinity level stays at a decent range. And yeah, may your coral growth slow down a little bit? Yeah, but who cares? Honestly, who cares? Don't chase pH. If your tank settles somewhere between a 7.75, 7.8, and 8.2, be satisfied with that. It's going to be fine. Beginner mistake number 34 comes from our friend Dubai Reefer on Instagram, and it is not testing enough. If you don't test your tank frequently, I'm talking at a minimum once a week, you will have no sense of how your tank is doing overall. Now, you don't have to test everything every single week. Starting out a new tank, you're going to want to test for your ammonia, your nitrite, and your nitrate. If your tank is settling in and having some swings every week, you're probably going to want to test for your phosphate and your nitrate levels to make sure that they're somewhat stable. If you add a lot of corals in, you're probably going to want to test for your alkalinity and your calcium. When I'm testing my tanks, what I do is I test for nitrates and phosphates every 3 or 4 days. And then once a week, I test for nitrates, I test for phosphates, calcium, and alkalinity. And that's pretty much. I'll occasionally test for something like magnesium, like iodine if I need to, but really test frequently, record your data, and you will be able to see swings and stop problems before they occur in your tanks. Our 10th and final category is gear, and coming in at beginner mistake number 35 is using metal fittings and metal clamps. Don't use metal in this hobby. Just don't do it. Don't use metal hose clamps, even though they're super easy to find, and don't use metal pieces of piping or fittings. They're going to rust and leach things into your tank over time. And use plastic fittings. Mistake number 36 is RODI flooding. I now make my RODI water outside, and I've installed an auto shutoff valve. But for years, I did it in our apartment, and I have almost made the mistake a couple times where you turn on your RODI filter and you know it's going to take you 8 hours to fill up, and you forget about it. Come home and there is water everywhere. Either set a timer or go ahead and learn how to install a float valve, which will automatically turn the RODI filter off once the water reaches a certain height in the bucket. 37th common beginner mistake is scratching your glass using a magnetic algae scraper. You have to be careful when you're using an algae scraper near your sand bed. If you get little pieces of sand stuck in between the glass and the algae scraper, you can just scratch the heck out of your tank. And once you scratch it, I guarantee you, you're gonna notice it forever, and it's gonna bug you, and you're gonna wish you didn't scratch your glass. So be careful anytime you're using a magnetic algae scraper near the sand bed that you don't scratch your glass. Mistake number 38 is not putting a lid on your tank. Don't be like me when I started out by thinking, oh, I don't want to put a lid on my tank because I like kind of the infinite feel of it. Your fish are gonna jump out. They just are. And if your fish don't jump out, your cat are gonna jump in. Either have something custom made for you, buy an innovative marine system that comes with a lid, or watch one of my many DIY videos on how to make a lid yourself. It's not the prettiest thing to look at, but please, 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 either buy or build yourself a mesh screen top. It will save you a lot of time, a lot of headache, and most importantly, it will save the lives of your livestock. Common beginner mistake number 39. Oh no, I repeated this one. So there's actually only 39 and not 40, but we're just gonna gloss over that. It's an important one anyways. Number 39 was recommended by RJ Lopez 24 and March 418 on Instagram, and their advice is buy an RODI filter early. So the mistake, not buying an RODI filter early enough. Trust me, trust me, trust me. I'm not the only one who says this. I'm not just trying to get you to buy something. Buy it from your local fish store, buy it from anywhere, but buy an RODI filter early on and you won't regret it. Beginner mistake number 40, it's actually 39 because I repeated it, but whatever, we're gonna go with 40. Number 40 is not organizing your wires. Now, why would you spend hundreds of dollars, and if you reach my obsession at this point, tens of thousands of dollars, and then just leave your wires bunched and ugly? Not only is it gonna be a hassle, not only is it a safety issue, but this hobby is beautiful, and so many of us get into it because it's a beautiful hobby. So don't stop the beauty with your tank and your fish and your livestock. Spend the time, learn how to properly organize your wires so even your wire management can be a thing of beauty. Okay, we did it. Now, which one of those 39, 40 do you agree with the most, and which one do you disagree with the most? Because I'm sure that not everyone here is going to agree. Put a comment down below, let us know what you agree with and what you disagree with and what you would advise differently. If you're a beginner and you found this helpful, please consider subscribing to Marine Depot and My First Fish Tank, giving this video a thumbs up. As always, everybody, don't forget to tune in next Friday where we're going to discuss everything relating to reef rock. Happy reefing, everybody. Be well. We'll see you next time.